Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
I've learned that every family has its hierarchy, its pecking order, no matter how much they pretend otherwise. Some families hide it better than others. Ours didn't even try. From the time I was in middle school, it was made painfully obvious that my cousin Brandon was the rising star, the golden boy, the one with potential, while I was the quiet one in the corner who read too much, talked too little, and apparently didn't do anything worthy of a Sunday dinner anecdote. Uncle Rick, my mom's older brother, made it a personal mission to remind me of that fact every single holiday. Subtly at first, then more and more directly as the years passed. I would show up to Thanksgiving with a new job or a quiet win, like the time I helped a local nonprofit land a six-figure grant, and he'd wave it off with a fake smile before launching into a loud, beer-fueled monologue about Brandon's latest business idea, or how he got invited to speak at a tech event, or how the mayor shook his hand. It was like being trapped in an endless PowerPoint presentation about someone else's inflated resume. So by the time New Year's Eve rolled around this year, I already knew what kind of evening I was walking into. Same rented event space at the country club. Same 40 or so relatives. Same spread of catered finger food trying too hard to look fancy. I had parked at the far end of the lot, rehearsing my smile in the rearview mirror like I always did before these things. It's funny, you never forget how to armor up when you've been raised to expect subtle jabs every time you pour yourself a drink. Inside, the place buzzed with faux excitement. Everyone pretending to care about resolutions they wouldn't keep. Laughter that came just a beat too quickly. I spotted Brandon almost immediately, perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect posture. He looked like he'd walked out of an overpriced lifestyle ad for a watch no one actually knows how to use. People were already gathered around him, sipping champagne, nodding like disciples. I felt like I was walking into a church where he was the god. I kept my distance, sticking to a corner with my glass of water and a plate of shrimp that tasted like regret. My mom found me, gave me the usual hug and a whispered, "Just try to smile tonight, okay?" which sounded more like a plea than advice. She meant well. She always did. But even she had stopped correcting Uncle Rick years ago when he'd make those little digs. She called it picking battles, but I knew better. She just didn't want to rock the boat. That boat had been sinking since I was 12. It was around 10:30 when it happened. Right on cue, like it had been rehearsed, Uncle Rick raised his glass and tapped a fork against it to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted in that performative way people do when they think something important is about to be said. I was already bracing for it, fingers tightening around my glass. "Well, folks," he began, already grinning, cheeks red with alcohol and pride, "I just want to say how proud I am tonight. This family, we've got some real stars in it, don't we? But one of them has really outdone himself this year. My boy Brandon," and here he paused for applause, which of course came, "has just opened his first restaurant. Right in downtown Charleston, high-end, beautiful place. You should see the write-up in the paper. Amazing stuff. Michelin star dreams, I tell ya. And to think, he's only 35. Laughter. Clapping. Some whoops. Brandon waved a hand like it embarrassed him, but we all knew he was eating it up like it was caviar. Then Rick turned toward me, still holding that stupid grin, and that's when he dropped it. "And you, Jenna," he said, loud enough that heads turned. "What have you done lately?" The silence that followed was sharp, fast, and full of electricity. Every face around the table shifted in my direction like spotlights in a police lineup. I could hear the ice in my glass crack as it adjusted to the warmth of my palm. I let the silence breathe. Let it grow a little uncomfortable. Let him think I was stunned or flustered. I wasn't. I was patient. And I'd been waiting for this moment for a very, very long time. So I took a sip of my champagne slowly, without looking away, and then I said it, calm and clear. "I invested in it," I said. Quietly. There was a beat, half a second, maybe less, where no one quite registered what I meant. Then I saw it, the twitch in Brandon's cheek, the way his grip tightened around the stem of his flute. The pause in Uncle Rick's raised arm, like someone had hit freeze frame on his little celebration. Aunt Melissa stopped mid-giggle. My mom turned toward me, lips slightly parted, eyes blinking twice like maybe she'd heard wrong. I'm sorry, what? Uncle Rick finally said, chuckling, clearly assuming it was a joke. You mean, like, you went to the opening? I shook my head, letting the smirk rise just a bit, not a full smile, just enough to feel like truth. No, I said. I mean, I own part of it. I've been investing in the company that backed it. For a while now. You could have heard a pin drop. It's a rare thing, watching a man realize he might not be the smartest person in the room after all. Rick's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. Brandon looked away, toward the bar, as if someone might rescue him from what was quickly becoming the worst moment of his very curated life. I just sipped my drink again and let it sink in. Let them all sit with it. The thing about quiet people is, when we finally speak, we make sure every word lands like a punch. And trust me, that one hit the ribs. There's a specific kind of silence that wraps itself around you when you've been betrayed by someone who used to sit next to you at the kids' table every Thanksgiving, someone who once rode bikes with you around the cul-de-sac until the streetlights came on, someone who pretended to be your partner in harmless childhood crime, but ended up becoming the adult version of every warning you ever ignored. That silence isn't the peaceful kind, it's the kind that burns slowly in your chest, tightens around your spine, and shows up at family functions dressed like politeness. And even though it's been years since it all started, I remember it with an uncomfortable clarity, like the moment someone first tells you that they don't see you as an equal, not because you're not capable, but because it's easier for them to win if you're left in the shadows. It began about 5 years ago, back when I was naive enough to believe that family still meant protection, or at least a safe audience. At the time, I had just left a miserable job working under a creative director who thought women shouldn't speak during meetings unless they were offering coffee. I'd had enough of being someone else's background character, so I cashed out a modest severance and gave myself one promise. I would try something of my own, even if it failed. I spent the better part of that winter sketching out what I thought might be my next chapter. I called it Root, a modest food truck concept that focused on sustainable, locally sourced plant-based meals that could actually satisfy a normal human appetite. It wasn't just about food, it was about rebuilding routines and dignity for people who'd been burned out and overlooked, like me. I had a business plan, some decent connections through an old nonprofit partner, and enough savings to build a minimum viable version by late summer. Brandon, of course, had just wrapped a project in Atlanta and was between opportunities, which is how he phrased it when he'd blown through investor cash for an app no one needed and spent more time at yoga studios than at his desk. But still, he had charm, and Rick always made sure we knew he was the smartest person under 40 in the family, so when he reached out to me for coffee, just to catch up, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I should have. Maybe that was my first mistake, forgetting that people who have everything handed to them eventually learn how to take from others without asking. I remember sitting at the coffee shop on East Bay Street, the one with the cracked leather booths and a little chalkboard sign that read "Ideas are currency." I showed him everything: the name, the logo I designed, the vision for rotating seasonal menus, the spreadsheet with projected margins. He nodded a lot, asked a few shallow questions, made a face when I mentioned self-funding, but then said, "No, I like it. It's got soul. Real direction." I didn't catch it then, that glimmer in his eyes when he realized I'd done the heavy lifting. I thought he was impressed. I didn't realize he was already seeing ways to wear my idea like a custom suit. 2 months passed. I didn't hear from him. I was knee-deep in legal paperwork for permits, trying to work through the red tape that comes with any mobile business in this city, when a friend from Charlotte forwarded me a link. No subject line. Just the link. I clicked it, expecting a meme or something harmless, but what loaded on my screen made my stomach clench so tight I had to sit down. It was a digital press release. Clean, corporate, with Brandon's face smiling next to some rustic logo reading "Grain and Root." Not root, grain and root. A new plant-forward kitchen concept, aiming to revolutionize the Southern eating experience with clean flavors and bold purpose. Every detail, every damn word sounded like mine, just stripped of the heart and dressed up in buzzwords. There were investor quotes, a sleek promo video, even a launch date for a brick-and-mortar space. Not a truck. Not a humble, low-overhead start. No. This was flashy. Expensive. It was like watching someone hijack your dream mid-flight and repaint it in colors you'd never choose. I called him immediately. Straight to voicemail. I texted. Nothing. I waited until the next family dinner, which, of course, I dreaded like a dentist appointment, but I needed to confront him face to face. I needed to look him in the eye and ask him why. He acted confused at first, like I was being overly dramatic, misremembering the conversation, like maybe I'd imagined the whole pitch session over coffee. "Jenna," he said, putting on that calm, calculated tone that only made it worse, "ideas are just air until someone builds them. You know that." I must have stood there blinking for 10 full seconds, trying to decide if I was going to scream or throw up. I didn't either. I just turned to Rick, who'd been watching the entire thing with a proud grin and arms crossed, and I said, "Did you know about this?" He didn't even blink. Brandon showed initiative. "That's what matters," he said. "You can't claim ownership of an idea unless you follow through." He's doing something with it. That moment, that exact exchange, burned itself into my brain. It was the moment I stopped believing in fairness. It was the moment I realized that in our family, success wasn't about merit or creativity or heart. It was about noise and timing and connections. And I didn't have the stomach to fight them on their terms. But I could outthink them. And I could wait. What Rick and Brandon didn't know then was that their arrogance was a weakness. They assumed silence meant surrender, that I was too soft, too sentimental, too safe to come for what was mine. They mistook patience for passivity, and they forgot one critical thing about people like me. When we're quiet, we're not doing nothing. We're building. And while they raised toasts and chased headlines and made sure their names were printed in gold on menus they didn't fully understand, I got to work with someone who knew how to play the long game better than either of them. But we'll get to Sam later. For now, just know that Brandon doesn't remember that coffee meeting. But I do. I remember everything. There's a strange kind of pleasure in being underestimated, a quiet power that most people never learn to wield because they're too busy trying to prove themselves to people who've already made up their minds. But when you stop needing to be seen, when you finally give up on applause you'll never get, you gain a freedom most people don't even recognize as strength. You become invisible in the best possible way. And when no one is watching, that's exactly when you start to build something real. That's where my story pivoted. Not with a dramatic confrontation or some righteous outburst at a family dinner, but with a long, quiet phone call to the only person I trusted with my shame, my plans, and most importantly, my rage, Sam. Sam and I met a decade ago at a grant writing workshop I barely remember signing up for. At first glance, we were polar opposites. He was all facts, all numbers, a spreadsheet wizard with a brain that worked like a machine, while I was driven by instinct and impulse, scribbling ideas on napkins and second-guessing everything. But over time, our dynamic found its rhythm. Where I saw vision, he saw structure. Where I saw opportunity, he saw risk and how to manage it. He never told me what I wanted to hear, only what I needed to. And after the Brandon fiasco, when I finally called him, barely able to get the words out, he didn't coddle me, didn't say it would all be okay. He just said, "All right, let's figure out what they're actually building and how to beat them at it." It started with digging. Not dramatic hacking or private investigators, just the good old-fashioned way: paperwork, filings, press releases, investor logs. Brandon's restaurant idea wasn't entirely his, of course. Beneath the surface-level branding and Instagram-worthy photos was a mid-sized hospitality group out of Charlotte that was quietly investing in boutique food concepts up and down the East Coast. Their money, their connections, their lawyers, Brandon was merely a local face, a shiny storefront for their back-end operations. And that, frankly, was the best news I could have asked for, because it meant the actual power was elsewhere. It meant that Brandon, for all his ego and bluster, wasn't steering the ship. He was just smiling for the camera while someone else held the map. Over the next year, I did something completely out of character. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself at dinners or explain my silence when family asked how work was going. I nodded, smiled, made vague jokes about consulting, and let them think I was fading into obscurity while Brandon thrived. But behind the scenes, I was slowly taking a different route to the very same table he thought he owned. Through Sam's contacts and a few key introductions, I started putting money, not a lot at first, but just enough, into the same parent company that Brandon's restaurant operated under. It was smart money, clean money, boring money, the kind these firms crave from people who don't ask for meetings or attention. I became a quiet partner. Then I started attending investor calls under my LLC's name, listening, learning, waiting. And after 2 more rounds of funding, I became something else entirely, a majority stakeholder. That's the part that still makes my fingers tingle when I think about it. Not because I wanted revenge, not just because I wanted to win, but because they didn't even notice it happening. While Brandon was giving interviews about his vision, while Rick was boasting at poker nights about his son's genius, I was slowly building the leverage I needed. Brick by brick. Dollar by dollar. Not to destroy them, no, but to finally reclaim the space they'd stolen from me. When I finally revealed the truth on New Year's Eve, that moment when I said I had quietly invested in the very restaurant they were toasting, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the years they spent mocking what they didn't understand, dismissing every idea I had as cute or idealistic or unrealistic, while blindly throwing their support behind a man who, at his core, had never created anything of his own. It was about that smirk Rick wore every time he said Brandon was unnatural, as if talent were something you inherited like a wristwatch, and not something you earned by working through doubt and rejection and fear. I watched their faces change slowly that night as the meaning of my words sank in. At first there was confusion, the kind that comes from realizing you've misread someone for years. Then came disbelief, the reflexive denial that people like Rick always reach for when the narrative slips from their fingers. But what followed was my favorite part, the silence. That thick, uncomfortable, undeniable silence that comes when the floor finally drops out from under a lie, and no one knows how to land without breaking something. Brandon had laughed at first, tried to pass it off like I'd misread something, maybe invested in a side project or a holding company with some distant connection. But when I named the fund, when I listed the rounds, when I referenced board meetings and voting rights and specific clauses in the partnership agreement, that's when the color left his face. That's when the people around us, the cousins, the in-laws, even Aunt Melissa with her eternally pursed lips, stopped pretending to be neutral. You could feel the power dynamic shifting in real time, like tectonic plates beneath the room. Rick tried to step in, of course. He puffed out his chest, cleared his throat, asked what kind of games I was playing. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I simply pulled out my phone and opened the investor portal, held it up so he could see my name, my stake, the documents. I didn't need to argue. The facts were louder than anything he'd ever shouted at a dinner table. That night, I didn't just reveal that I owned Brandon's restaurant. I revealed that I had watched them all underestimate me for years, and I used that blindness as fuel. I didn't take Brandon's dream away. I simply bought it out from under him. And he never even saw it coming. The most dangerous thing you can ever do to a person like my Uncle Rick is take away the illusion that he's the one in control, that his loud voice, his big gestures, and his constant need to dominate a room are actually masking something fragile and hollow underneath. Because when men like him realize they've been outplayed, not with noise or ego, but with strategy and patience, something inside them cracks, and they don't know how to cover the sound. So when Brandon stormed into the kitchen that night, cheeks burning with something halfway between rage and confusion, and Rick trailed behind him looking like someone had just spit in his drink, I followed them not because I wanted to gloat, not because I needed to explain myself, but because I had one final truth to lay bare, and it had been waiting to surface for far too long. They were arguing before I even walked in, whisper shouting like boys who'd been caught doing something they shouldn't have, voices bouncing off the industrial steel of the prep counters like it was a bad high school play. Brandon was fuming, asking how the hell something like this could have happened without him knowing, listing names and dates, trying to piece together the exact moment control had slipped through his fingers, while Rick kept insisting there must be a misunderstanding. that I couldn't possibly hold a controlling interest, that there were legal protections in place, which, of course, there were, but not for him. I closed the door behind me slowly, let the latch catch just loud enough to stop their back and forth, and when they turned to look at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in either of their faces before: fear, not in the physical sense, but the kind that comes from realizing you've made a mistake you can't unmake, and the person standing in front of you is no longer the version of them you once dismissed, but something else entirely, something you don't know how to handle. You want to know how I did it? I asked, not because I thought they deserved the answer, but because I wanted them to hear it out loud, in plain, brutal language. You both talk so much, all the time, about how hard it is to build something, how risky it is to take a chance, but neither of you has ever actually done it. Brandon, you just dress up other people's ideas, and Rick, you just throw money at things you don't understand and take credit when they work. But me? I sat in silence for years and learned how this world actually moves. I learned that control isn't about making noise, it's about knowing when to wait and when to strike. Brandon scoffed, leaned against the fridge like he needed the cold to cool his temper, and muttered something about family betrayal, which might have stung if it hadn't come from the same mouth that once told me, with a straight face, that loyalty was for people who couldn't innovate. Don't you dare talk to me about betrayal, I snapped, my voice steady but rising now, because I had swallowed that word for too long. You think I forgot what you did? You think I don't remember how you stole my idea, my work, my future, and acted like it was just business? You sat across from me, drank coffee on my dime, smiled while I laid out every piece of something I built from nothing, and then you walked away and sold it like it was yours. And Rick? You stood there, arms crossed, proud as hell, because your son was finally acting like the shark you always said he needed to be. Rick raised a hand, as if that gesture still had power, but I cut him off before he could speak. You told me once, I continued, that I was wasting my potential by working remote, that I was hiding from the real world. What you didn't know was that during those years I was wasting my time. I was building networks, investing wisely, listening in on calls, attending seminars, and watching exactly how people like you operate: loud, reckless, overconfident. You built this stage thinking no one else would ever dare step on it, and now that I have, you're panicking because you know I don't need you anymore. Not for funding. Not for validation. Not for a single thing. There was a moment, just one, where I saw Rick falter, his posture shifting ever so slightly, like a man who just realized the room he designed is no longer his. But let's be clear, I said, my tone colder now, razor sharp, because I wasn't just settling scores, I was delivering a warning. I'm not here to burn down what you built. That would be too easy. I'm here to remind you that you don't own everything just because you say it louder than the rest of us. From this moment forward, every decision made in that restaurant runs through me. Every menu change, every partnership, every hiring choice, I have the final say. You can slap your name on the sign all you want, Brandon, but when the checks are signed, they'll be signed by me. Brandon turned away, fists clenched, biting back whatever fragile comeback he had brewing, but Rick, he just stood there, eyes narrowing, as if trying to calculate whether I was bluffing or whether the rules of the game had truly changed. And then he said, almost too quietly, "Why didn't you just come to me?" And for a second I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of that question broke something open in me. "I did come to you," I said. "Every holiday. Every phone call. Every time I showed up with an idea, or a win, or a plan, I came to you. And you never saw me. You were too busy watching Brandon shine to notice the fire burning under my feet." I turned then, hand on the door, pausing only long enough to glance over my shoulder. "If you want to toast to your son tonight, go ahead," I said. "But I suggest you raise your glass to the person who actually owns the restaurant." And with that, I walked out, leaving them both in that cold, steel kitchen, surrounded by the echo of a truth they could no longer ignore. The party hadn't noticed I was gone. They were too busy sipping their drinks, laughing at jokes, pretending nothing had cracked beneath the surface, but I knew better. I knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. And while the claps might still go to Brandon, the power, the control, the leverage, all of it had shifted. But they didn't know the full story. Not yet. And I wasn't done. The strange thing about revenge, and I say this not with pride, but with a certain sobering clarity, is that when it finally arrives, when you've played every card exactly right, when you've moved in silence long enough that the people who once spoke over you are now left speechless, it doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes, it just feels like silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles after a storm, but the sort that lingers in the air like smoke after a building burns, a heavy, suspended quiet that no one knows what to do with. So, as I stepped back out into the main hall, leaving Rick and Brandon behind in that polished kitchen with its hollow steel counters and broken illusions, I wasn't smiling or smirking or reveling in my win. I was simply breathing slowly, like someone who had been holding her breath for far too long. The crowd had resumed its performance. There were people dancing again near the DJ booth, mostly cousins and a few of their friends who didn't know or care about the shift that had just occurred behind the curtain. The champagne was flowing. The appetizers were being passed around by young servers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and somewhere near the fireplace, Aunt Melissa was still nursing the same glass of white wine she'd been holding since 8. She glanced at me as I walked by, but didn't say anything, didn't raise a brow or offer a smile, which, for her, was an acknowledgement of defeat in its own way. My mother found me again near the dessert table. She always seemed to do that, appear right when something inside me was turning sharp or tired. Her eyes searched my face, not with judgment but with concern laced in something harder to define, like confusion wrapped in maternal hesitation. She looked at me the way someone might look at a painting they suddenly realized they'd never understood. "I heard," she said quietly, not asking, just offering the words as if placing them on a tray between us. I didn't pretend to be surprised. Of course she'd heard. That kind of shift in a family doesn't go unnoticed. It travels through rooms like static, like heat rising from pavement. Everyone feels it before they fully grasp what it means. Her voice wavered slightly as she asked the next question, one that had clearly been weighing on her tongue for longer than a few minutes. "Did you really do all of this, just to get back at them?" The question landed in my chest harder than I expected. Not because it was unfair, and not because it was wrong, but because it revealed something I hadn't yet said out loud, even to myself. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw the woman who raised me on resilience, but not rebellion, who taught me how to be kind before she ever taught me how to protect myself, and I realized that in her eyes, all of this, the moves, the silence, the final strike, looked less like justice and more like bitterness. "No," I said eventually, the word heavy in my throat. "Not just to get back at them." She didn't press. She just nodded slowly and reached for a napkin she didn't need, her hands needing something to do. And I stood there, surrounded by laughter and music and the ever-present clink of celebration, thinking about how many versions of myself I had to shed just to stand here in this exact moment. The girl who used to memorize business articles in the back of Rick's house during family barbecues. The young woman who cried in her car after Brandon unveiled the press release that stole her dream. The sister, the daughter, the cousin who had been too quiet, too polite, too unwilling to make noise because she'd been raised to believe that noise was the enemy of grace. But now I knew better. Success is loudest when it's silent. You don't always need to shout across the room when you've already shifted its center of gravity. You don't have to scream to be heard when your very presence rewrites the rules of the space you're in. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most deafening thing in the world is the quiet realization that the person you dismissed for years now holds the strings to the stage you thought you owned. Fireworks started outside around midnight. People rushed toward the windows, phones held high, recording the sky as if they could capture something permanent from the brief burst of color and noise. I stayed where I was. The explosions were loud, yes, but they didn't shake me. I'd already had my detonation. Mine just happened indoors, without smoke or spectacle. Brandon never reappeared in the main hall that night. Neither did Rick. I don't know what was said between them after I left, and to be honest, I didn't care enough to ask. For the first time in years, their silence was not my burden to carry. It was theirs. They could figure out what to do with it. Whether they buried it, denied it, or finally sat with it, it no longer concerned me. As the crowd started counting down to the new year, 10, 9, 8, I moved toward the exit, coat in hand, avoiding the glances that still came from a few corners of the room. Some people looked impressed, others confused, and a few looked uneasy, like they weren't sure whether to cheer for me or quietly resent the shift they didn't quite understand. And that was fine. I didn't need applause. I didn't need their approval. I had something better: leverage, truth, and a future that no longer required their permission. Outside, the cold wrapped around me like a closing parenthesis. I zipped my coat, walked slowly through the nearly empty parking lot, the distant thud of fireworks behind me, and let the final thought rise in my chest without trying to suppress it: I don't know if I won tonight. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. It wasn't clean or pretty or noble. There was no ribbon cutting, no speech, no perfect ending. But they stopped laughing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.